Welcome to CRS360. This is a webinar series designed to bring you topical, relevant content on a regular basis, in addition to our three-day extravaganza every February in Nashville, which we call CRS. And today's topic is called, as you can see on the screen, Back to the Future. And I feel like there needed to be some reverb on that title that I just gave you, Back to the Future. Let me set the scene for you. The year is 2018, and the CRS panel is called Radio 2025. The future is now. The panel is moderated by Bob Richards, who you see on the screen here. Also joining the panel is Mike McVay, who at the time was the Executive VP of Content and Programming for Cumulus Media. Rod Phillips, the Senior VP for iHeart Country, was on that session. And also a guy by the name of Larry Miller, the Director of Music Business Program at NYU. We're rejoined today by Mike McVay and Bob Richards, and we are joined by Carletta Blake, most recently of WGAR in Cleveland. So welcome, Carletta. Thank you, Michael and Bob, for rejoining this and kind of revisiting this. I'm RJ Curtis, the Executive Director for CRS. And today, what I'd like to do is revisit what we talked about in 2018, not to go nostalgic and live in the past, but to talk about some of the content that Bob, brought to the table with our panel, and compare what's happening now with what's transpired in the past 7 years. It's October, but I'm rounding up to 2025, so I'm saying that it's 7 years now since 2018. And I think it's a good panel today because we have a perspective from the corporate level with Mike in his role at Cumulus at the time. Bob, at the time that he moderated this session, was the market manager for Emmis Indianapolis, which is Emmis's home market. And Carletta, back in 2018, you were still in Raleigh then. This is before your time at WGAR. So now you're sitting out a little bit, you're taking a pause on programming, and your perspective on the sidelines is very valuable. And actually, Bob, too, after your time at Emmis, you took, what was it, 2 years off of the business?
I did, yeah, about 2 years.
Yeah, so I think that your perspective on that, just sitting outside, it's always interesting to get out of the game for a minute and kind of look at it from the outside. And Mike, now your role now, this is truly back to the future for you, because before you took on the role at Cumulus, you had your successful McVay Media company, and now you're back doing that. So I think everybody has a lot of perspective to bring to the table. So I want to start, and I'll start with you, Mike. If you can think about 2018, what was going on then, and now, again, rounding up to 2025, what's different from 2018 in the radio business and maybe country specifically, and what's the same? What hasn't changed?
Yeah, I mean, if you start with country and music itself, the format's much hotter today than it was back then. There was no talk of artificial intelligence. It was all about the smart speaker, and that was growing. There was a consolidation of roles inside stations where people were now being asked to write blogs for their websites and what have you. And I think also you had a continuing consolidation with companies putting more markets together. Some shared programmers across a couple markets, some shared managers, but that was all very new at that time. At that time, the real focus was just on, what are we going to do electronically? How do we get people to come back to our stations or stay longer? What are we going to do about these spot loads that are just exploding? That was a lot of the conversation at that point in 2018.
And Bob, what do you remember from 2018? What's the same? What's different? Of course, what I didn't mention here, and I should throw that in now, is in the middle of that, in the middle of these 7 years that we've seen transpire, we had something called a pandemic. And that blew up a lot of things and changed a lot of rules and the way we program, and we had to recover a lot of audience. I know we'll circle back to that later on. But Bob, thinking back to your role with Emmis and now some time off.
So Mike said it, the format is hotter now, and it's, I think that along with that, the tent is even bigger. Country has, had, gosh, for a long time now, been expanding the tent of artists who are in our format, and that's grown even more over the past 7 years. And while some people think that may be watering down country, I don't believe that at all. I think that, not only are we not losing our soul, we're adding to it with the artists who are coming into the format and bringing their soul and their music into the format, but giving it the country flavor as they see it. I think, the obvious thing that's changed is AI. But one of those things that I'm a little surprised at when I went back to take a look at that panel in 2018, and while the three of us have changed positions, I'm kind of surprised that the leadership within our major radio groups has not changed. That, we've still have not just at the executive level, but in leadership positions. So in talking in the panel about needing fresh perspective and a fresh outlook, we still have a lot of those leaders who in 2018 are now leading us and could be one of the reasons why we're still we still suffer from some of the same issues. I don't know, but was one of the things that when I looked at, okay, that really hasn't changed that much.
Yeah, quick thought on the leadership, and Mike, I'd love your perspective on this very quickly. It's true, the leadership of the major radio companies is the same, and those companies, compared to 2018, are under much more duress than they were back in 2018. Mike, would you agree with that? The just the debt service and the pressure on a publicly traded company is very intense.
Yeah, very, very much so. I mean, I've said multiple times in multiple platforms that the first wave of consolidators brought a lot of debt onto companies. And so now the second and third wave of leadership in those consolidating companies are trying to shovel out from under it. And radio is still a great, amazing business today. It's just financed poorly in a number of situations, and that impacts everything, I think.
Yeah, for sure. So, Carletta, in 2018, you were in Raleigh. You were programming the iHeart station in Raleigh. And this is before, and I was trying to backtrack and see when you made the transition to Cleveland and had a great run there. That was like 2 jobs ago, and then the pandemic in there too. And certainly on the day-to-day side, that was really challenging for programmers and personality. So when you think about your journey from 2018 to now, what do you think has changed? Obviously, your personal situation has changed right now, but you're going to get married.
Yep.
Yeah, you're raising a kid. You're focusing on that right now. What's different from 2018 in the business, and what's the same?
Well, I mean, there was a lot. I think Mike and Bob both kind of touched on it, but from a programming standpoint and an on-air talent standpoint, in 2018, our focus was smart speakers in the home, trying to make sure that people knew that this was the new radio, that they were being able to still listen to their favorite radio station, even though a lot of traditional radios that we were used to were exiting the homes, and these were kind of coming in. I mean, I remember we talked about this earlier too, but the entire Edison research panel that year of 2018 was all about smart speakers. That's it. And we did that fairly well in 2018, but by 2020, that was a whole other game. And even talking about smart speakers is not even really a thing. Yes, you check to make sure that the command still works at once a month, but that's about it. I mean, other than that, it's not like you're promoting it the way that we did back then. Blogging was definitely the hot ticket. Web hits was where you were trying to get to. And while you wanted people to be aware that you were able to stream your station, it wasn't the push that it is now. I think that the pandemic definitely changed the way that people are consuming all audio, and it escalated and really quickened the way that we were transitioning from listening to traditional terrestrial radio to digitally listening to your traditional radio as well. So I think that's been one of the major shifts. And social media. Social media was kind of a thing, but it wasn't nearly the push that it is now to a talent, especially.
Yeah, I mean, in evaluating talent, that's a big part of what they can bring to the table. It's not just their performance on the air; it's what kind of engagement they can generate on a daily basis. And there are thresholds that personalities are expected to hit as part of their job, right?
Yes, and they're high. um, and to be completely truthful, sometimes that pressure, I honestly think, can negate what they're trying to accomplish, because the pressure can be so high sometimes that you kind of feel pigeonholed and you're like, I don't know what to do. And you lose that creative force that is so important. But you're also, I mean, if you think about it, we talk about this a lot, but radio was the original influencer, right?
Yes.
And
Yes.
now influencer is everywhere. It's from everything to not only celebrities and people that we look at in a public figure stance, but anybody that is on social media can be a big influencer to a micro influencer with their followers. So there's a lot more competition.
Yeah. You mentioned the smart speaker survey that we did. I just in reviewing the session, and by the way, I want to mention that session that we're referring to, the session back in 2018, it's available on countryradioseminar.com. If you look on the archive section, you can drop down and find that. It's quite interesting. Mike McVay remains one of the best dressed men in show business, and it's interesting to watch that, just to see some of the stuff that we've just discussed. But to your point, the focus of the Edison study that year was entirely on smart speakers. And I was talking to the head of programming from another radio group the other day, and I was talking about this session and smart speakers. And when I mentioned smart speakers, this person laughed out loud and said, "Smart speakers." And you just said it too, Carl. That's not even a thing. He says, "Who has one? Who uses those now?" So, but that was the big headline item. And I think about 2018 and the topic of smart speakers is to what we're talking about now with AI. We'll get to AI a little bit, but that was the big technological breakthrough that radio wanted to take advantage of at the time. So I just wonder, this was the focus. Smart speakers, where are we now with those compared to 2018? Anybody? Bob, let me start with you. When you think about that, because Emis has always been a company that's been sort of pushing the envelope on technology and breakthroughs. When you think back to 2018 and your role as the market manager, where was it then, and what do you think about it now?
Well, Carletta was right. I mean, at 2018, it was, and I think Mike has mentioned this before, this is radio's chance to get back into the home. And
Mhm.
hey, let's not mess this up. So, and I think there was an article that I saw in TechCrunch when I went back to do a little research for our call that said 2018 is when smart speakers reached critical mass. So high on our radar. And since then, it's while it's fallen off maybe within day-to-day radio focus. I know just from a focus group of one for my son and his kids, the smart speaker rules their household. I mean, it's much more than audio. It's shopping, it is scheduling, it's commands to the kids when it's bath time. So, and in some cases, people have smartphone or smart speakers set up to run their household. And so then back up to, or I should say, move to a radio perspective. If you take a look at smart speaker time spent listening, it is dramatically higher than most other devices. So while it may not be on our radar, still very, very important because of that time spent listening piece. People just spend a lot more time when they've engaged with radio through a smart speaker than they do through most other devices.
And Carletta, you had said something to me, and that makes me form a question for Mike here, because I think you said to me the other day that uh, the smart speaker initiative really it went from the station level and became kind of a corporate company initiative that
Mhm.
they control. Mike, was that the case with Cumulus and other companies? Did they take that over and make it a company-wide initiative that corporate kind of directed?
Yeah, we did. I mean, when it first happened, I did look at it as like, oh my gosh, here's a chance to put radio back in the homes. because very few people have actual radios. And so we ran lots of promos. We talked about it. We had people, set up the welcome and departure messages. But, with all due respect to the head of programming you were talking to, I'm with Bob in that the smart speaker is still very relevant and in a lot of different rooms. It's used for timing. I can walk through my kitchen and hear the smart speaker saying something's done or check the water. Um, but the communication, then was very important to us. And now it's become universal and people don't think about it. And it's very much like this thing. I mean, this is where a lot of people hear radio today, and you're hard pressed to find people who go out and buy an actual radio. Because why would you when radio's on so many platforms?
Yeah, it seems like it went from that shiny object and that fascinating new gadget that we're all, just obsessed with, to a utility in the house that's useful for what Bob was saying, for, managing the household and the kids. And it's just there. I think we all, I mean, I disagree too with this person who said, who has those? Well, I think everybody has one. But it's sort of like having a light bulb in the house. You don't think
Yeah.
about it, but you're using it on a daily basis, so it becomes very utilitarian. But anybody on the panel, do you think that it did bring listening back into the house? Because I remember that was the conversation in 2018, the hope that would bring in-home listening back to radio and those levels would come up. Mike.
I think it was the Trojan horse. It brought radio back into the house, but it brought streaming into the
Brought
house,
everything else back with
which
it, right?
steamrolled the industry. And so when the pandemic happened and people were working from home and you have that smart speaker, suddenly now you're listening to Bob's content on the internet. You're listening to radio station content on the internet, but you also have Spotify and Pandora and Apple Music and all those things. And so there was a leveling of the playing field that the smart speaker brought. So I don't want that. I don't want anyone to walk away and say that I think it was a bad thing. I don't. It put us in the Evoke set. At least we're there with them, where we were really in danger of not being there with them.
Yeah. And on the station level, one final. Go ahead, Bob. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
I was going to say, yeah, Mike, to your point, in RJ, your question, to answer it, it brought audio back into the home in a prominent place. So along with radio, then came all of the other audio platforms, and including the one that I work for now, TuneIn. And so that then gave us a place, but from 2018 to 2025, the fragmentation of how people, their choices in audio, and that just continued to grow. And while we think of smart speakers usually as Google Home or Amazon, the number of smart speaker offerings has grown tremendously too, with Sonos, Bose, and all of the others that are available. So that's where I think there's another piece of, radio, but also all of the other audio offerings that then just accelerated the fragmentation.
Carletta, on a programmer level, with how close programmers and personalities at the station level stay with listeners, how close in touch, did you feel any response from listeners about your smart speaker skills that you were trying to communicate to people on the air? Did you get any people going, hey, that's really cool? Or was it just that utilitarian kind of usage?
Well, being in Raleigh at the time, we made a promo where we put an Alexa and a Google Home Play system against one another, and one was for Duke and one was for the Tar Heels. And then what they agreed on was that they could both listen to B93.9 together. So I would get people that would randomly come up to us and talk to us about that because they thought it was funny. So they were definitely listening and paying attention. But I don't really remember any specifics about being like, oh my gosh, I realized that I can listen to your station at home because of this. That might have been a happy byproduct, but I didn't get that necessarily, that type of feedback.
Yeah. Mike, to your Trojan horse point, and Bob talking about how it brought audio into the home, one of the other topics in that conversation, as you remember, Bob, uh, as the moderator was you guys talked a lot about competing platforms and how you did forecast that there would be more and more of them, consumption platforms where people are paying to not hear spots, and they want to rent their music. They don't want to own it anymore. And that certainly has been the case. Bob, you and I were talking the other day about some stats on the increased usage of Amazon and Spotify, the growth. I think the stat that we were discussing when we were prepping this call was in 2018, and these figures may be wrong, but what I found was there were 191 active monthly users for Spotify, and now there are 615 million of them. So that streaming platforms are exploding. And for Amazon in 2018, it was 30 million, and now it's 180 million. And it goes on and on with other platforms like podcasting that we talked about. That's had an effect on radio usage. And I think didn't streaming for certain demographics blow up, particularly during the pandemic?
Anecdotally, I would say that, radio was seeing an uptick when the pandemic hit. I mean, we were starting to see increased time spent listening when the pandemic hit, but everything changed then. I never really was somebody who would binge watch an entire series in a weekend. And, that takes up time away from audio when you do things like that. And so all of those things compete for our ears and our attention now. And so the level of competition is higher than ever and greater than ever. And there's every reason to believe that it will continue to increase.
RJ, sorry for that pause. I saw Mike's mouth moving, but he was muted. So I
didn't really direct the question at anybody.
It was a rookie mistake.
No, you need someone running the board for you. You're back to being a talent. I think the streaming's explosion through the pandemic also had a lot to do with people just weren't in their cars. And so with radio's time spent listening in cars and the greatest number of people using it in cars, but it also gave them a chance to find their favorite station in another way, distributed in another way during the pandemic. So, while listening was impacted, to Mike's point, people were still finding radio, just consuming it on a different platform.
Carletta, on the station level, it's hard to compete. Radio really isn't, technically set up to compete with some of the streaming services. But do you feel radio can counter program that? That's maybe a bigger conversation for an entirely different Focus 360. But just quickly, do you? When you know those numbers are growing, okay, because we've seen the stats over the past 7 years, and how do you as a programmer combat that?
I think that you have to really dial in on what it is that you're giving the consumer, and that you have to really be in touch with your audience and who is listening to you, and that you have to make sure that whatever it is that you're programming and that you're putting out into the world is what they want to hear. Because with so many options and having the opportunity to go to so many different places and to be able to curate exactly what they want when they want it, if you're not doing that for them, they'll go somewhere else.
One other thing that we talked about that was talked about on that session back then was, and this is a conversation that's been going on for years, is Nielsen and the measurement issues. So there was concern back then about the accuracy, the sample size, all that stuff. Mike, back then and compared to now, any difference now? And what are the challenges now versus 2018 in accurately measuring radio listening?
Well, I mean, I think there's still a problem with the sampling size and the methodology. We've all heard conversation around the fact that if Nielsen could figure out how to give people a free phone and the phone picked up what they were listening to, we'd have greater samples. But Nielsen doesn't want to, they're a business. They don't want to lose money to do that, and radio doesn't want to pay for that change. And so, we're at a high noon standoff in that regard. The fact that there's increased competition creates shorter time spent listening for everyone. we're seeing now where Nielsen plans to, in 2025, in PPM markets, change the need for 5 individual listened minutes in a quarter hour to 3. Theoretically, that should enable more people to count. But think about that. We're saying you got to give us 3 minutes in a quarter hour. Is it that bad? Are we at that place? And so I think they're trying to make up for a sampling problem by changing the rules. I also think that ad agencies are smart and they'll look at it and say, well, your ratings only went up because you changed your rules. So there's still a lot of things to sort through in that regard. Nielsen is still the best thing we have out there until we can get to the point to measure all impressions. If we were able to take the digital impressions and impressions you have on all these different platforms and put them together, that would be the ultimate. I don't think anybody's figured out how to do that yet.
Carletta, you were telling me kind of a horror story about the number of meters in Cleveland that because you guys see that every month, right? And it's astounding. I think programmers know this, but a lot of people don't know that, like, the amount of meters that is determining what your numbers look like is remarkably small.
One person can literally make or break a radio station. And I mean, that's just the reality that you live in whenever you're programming in a PPM market. And that's nothing that's astounding to anybody. I mean, everybody that's in programming knows that, like, you can have one person fall off the panel and your ratings, you can go from 3 to 10 in a heartbeat. I mean, it's definitely the biggest issue that we face as far as the Nielsen ratings and what that looks like. Is that's the one thing that I've heard from everyone over and over again is, why can we not figure out the sample sizing issue? And I mean, obviously there's a lot of factors that go into that. So
This move in 2025 to 3 minutes versus 5, that feels a little bit like moving the goalpost, like you said, Mike, changing the rules. Bob, do you think you're not in that game anymore? By the way, what I forgot to mention is you're on one of those emerging platforms that you guys discussed back in 2018. You're on TuneIn, managing the Sevens network. Not a concern for you anymore. I guess that's got to feel pretty good that's not your measurement. Your metrics are completely different in terms of the platform you're managing right now.
True. And while the metrics are different, there's still that focus on key metrics that you use to measure audience, listening hours, how many people are coming into each one of the stations, how many times their session starts each day. And so it is much different, though, in that, just the obvious, it's not a panel. So with Nielsen being panel research and this being actual number of people, it is much different. I'm really anxious to see the changes Nielsen is going to make in PPM in 2025, what impact that will have. I hope it's good for everyone, but I don't know, a little cynical, but I'm anxious to see how those results turn out.
A couple of the things that were talked about in 2018, and these are sort of classic conversations that have happened at CRS over the years, particularly recently with the talent development and recruitment issue. I remember, Mike, in that session, you were talking about how you found Elena Smith, and just tell that story again, because
Sure.
that's a great conversation about finding talent that ends up being a star in our format right now.
Yeah, and there were 2 people at that time that came up to the ranks, Elena Smith and Zach Sang. Elena, of course, um, ultimately became, Nights with Elena, which is the show she hosts now on Westwood One, and Zach is at Amazon doing programming there. But the 2 of them were both young people who made themselves aware as far as their awareness level they created was unique. Zach would take pictures of me from the trades, and if I was standing next to Bono, he would cut out Bono's face, put his in it, have a balloon coming out that said, "Wow, Mike, it's nice to meet you." And then I had a balloon saying, I love your show, Zach. And these things were showing up over and over and got my attention. I was at a worldwide radio summit in Los Angeles, and famous morning show Jeff and Jer brought Elena over and introduced her to me. She was a third or lesser mic on a show in San Diego while she was doing college. And those two things led to them having a couple jobs within Cumulus Westwood One before they rose to the big jobs they had, and then Zach going on to do his own thing. There are great talent out there still, young talent out there. And as we always sit back and say, well, we don't have overnight shows anymore. There's so many things better than that where you can find talent today if you're willing to listen to streaming, if you're willing to look at TikTok and social media. And so I continue to find young people that are just out there because they may be taking bites from some smaller radio station and posting it, or they're just creating great stuff on social media and they have no idea or inkling of how they could evolve it to mass media. You just got to look.
It seems like there should be more opportunity to find the hidden gems out there because all the citizen creators, right? I mean, everybody can be a creator. You can get on Instagram or TikTok. I see people on TikTok all the time that are, I think to myself as a former program director, that person should have a radio show. They're an amazing storyteller. Although on the younger side of that content creation and the citizen creator, radio isn't as sexy as it may have been, and maybe there's better ways to monetize your creativity on a social platform. And so it's hard to attract that demo into radio. And yet at the same time, I feel like a lot of what I see on social media from these citizen creators could really be improved by getting on the radio and doing a show like 4 hours a day. So the two could complement each other. How do we appeal to these digital natives who don't see radio as a sexy or a cool thing to pour their talents into? Bob, do you want to take that one?
I'll start, but I'd love to hear Carletta's perspective because she's been, deeper into the weeds there. RJ, I think we have to take some of the handcuffs off, and I think we have to take some of the, we know that there's certain formatics that help drive results in PPM and in diary. And some of those, are, you could call them non-negotiables. But I think those other handcuffs that we put on talent, especially developing talent, if we pull those off and let them be themselves and let them find their way, as Mike said, from a social media platform to mass media, on a terrestrial station or even a streaming station, then that's one of those steps we can take to make it much more appealing. But Carletta, I'd love to hear your perspective.
I think that whenever you're looking at content creators as a whole, I mean, that's basically what on-air talent has been doing for years. We've created content. It's all been theater of the mind. We've all heard that so many times. And that's exactly what we know that it is. And you have to appeal to that creative aspect from them, that's what they get to do every single day on the radio. And I also think that finding exactly what their big goal is. Do they want to be a national person? Do they want to stay local? What's the heartbeat of what their content is that they're creating? Are they charity driven? Are they funny? You know what I'm trying to say? You have to find what their specific heartbeat looks like and then appeal to them in that way.
Yeah, Carletta, when you on the station level, someone applies, what are the qualities that you're looking for? Do you look at their social media metrics and their engagement? I mean, what's the priority? Is it mainly about being able to execute a show on the radio station, or is it all of that stuff?
I honestly think it's all of it. And if we can't teach someone how to execute a radio show, what are we doing? Right? Like we should be all should be able to do that because at some point, none of us knew what we were doing either, and we all got taught. And I have carried what was said to me whenever I very first got the first on-air gig that I ever got, which was an overnight show in Dallas from Crash Poteet. And he told me that he could teach me all of the technique and he could teach me exactly what to do and when to turn on the mic and how to run the board, but that he could not teach me drive or passion and that I had those things already. And that's why he was giving me a chance. And I think that as long as you look for people that have drive and passion, we can teach them what radio can do for them.
I just want to ask, you started on the air in Dallas?
I did.
I was in Connellsville, Pennsylvania. She's in Dallas.
Yeah.
I was extremely, extremely blessed. I learned, in my opinion, from some of the absolute best people in the business between Crash Poteet and Carrie Swartzel at the time and Chris Huff, who was at KSCS because it was at the KSCS and then KTYS at the time was the station that I started at, and they were sister stations. And I could not have learned from a better group of radio talent between Alan Peck and Terry Dorsey and Hawkeye and everybody. It was an incredible experience for me to be like, this is what radio is.
Well, and I think being surrounded by that caliber of people probably accelerated your progress and your learning skill sets, right?
And it goes to the value of mentoring. I mean, it does go to that. And I know that all four of us here mentor other people because we've been blessed to have good mentors. And I hope everyone passes it forward.
RJ, I think one of our former bosses, Rick Cummings, summed it up well when it comes to radio talent. And what he loved to say was, it's so much easier to teach an interesting person radio than to teach a radio person to be interesting.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think that, finding new talent and radio talent has been a challenge over the years. I remember while I was working for Emmis and Rick Cummings and Jimmy Steele and that whole crew in Los Angeles, I think the industry went through this obsession with finding stand-up comics and giving them a radio show. And I think what we found for the most part, Mike, correct me if I'm wrong here, is that stand-up comics can do an hour of material, and it's just like, the number of jokes that they can tell in an hour is phenomenal. It's very different than doing a 4-hour radio show where there's pacing and there's ebbs and flows and there's music mixed in there. And a lot of those experiments with non-traditional talent didn't work. But I feel like it could work because there's so many of those content creators doing so many different things on all these different platforms that we have a great opportunity to find them and try and make radio appealing to them. Mike, would you agree with that?
It depends on how funny the comedian is and how good they are, right? A few years back, we were all running into that. We are lemmings in our business. So somebody has luck in a morning show with a comedian, and suddenly we all need a comedian. And I'd sit with people and say, look, Kimmel has 4 writers writing for him every day so he can do his show.
Right.
We don't have that, not generally. And so a comedian as a third mic or some part of a larger show is a good thing, but there still has to be that person who understands how to drive it, how to get things on and off, what the format is, and how to pull stuff out from everyone else. That hasn't changed. That hasn't changed for many, many years.
RJ, I think a couple of other areas to consider too is comp. If someone can make more being an influencer or building a social media following and monetize that than they can a radio personality. And I think the other piece is, to the taking the handcuffs off, it's having flexibility, to Carla's point earlier about what is important to those people who we're trying to attract as talent and helping them achieve what's important to them so that then we can all win. And then the third piece is the future prospects within the industry. What's your path of advancement? Is it a higher profile day part? Is it leadership? What is it? So those are other things that I think we need to consider when we're looking at recruiting and especially younger talent those things that are important to them.
I want to go kind of look to the future here in just a second, but before we do, and this is one of the reasons that I really am curious about Carletta's perspective here. As you signed off that session in 2018, Bob, you asked everyone to, what are you excited about in the next, several years? And Mike, I thought that your comment was interesting because you were very excited about working with younger programmers, specifically calling out millennial generation. They were at that time starting to rise up into more and more leadership positions. And you said, I want to know what they bring to the table, how they can challenge us and think differently and bring their perspective to programming and to radio. And you told a great story about someone that you'd hired outside of radio to program a station in San Francisco. I can't remember that person's name. If you want to just quickly recall that story.
Yeah, it was KFOG in San Francisco. And to be fair and honest, in 2020 hindsight, the person was the right person. The opportunity was the right opportunity. The station had a brand that had been greatly diminished by predecessors over the years. But in hiring this young man who had a really rich digital resume, I said, do a radio station like you're streaming. Do it like it's something you're streaming. And the concept and idea was one I stole from Daniel and Standig at Futuri to say, if radio was invented after the internet, if radio was created after the internet, what would radio be like? And so Matt DeVille was the guy, and he created a really good sounding radio station. But the cume was just so low by that point that we couldn't generate, and there was no marketing to invest in it. But I think that what he did sounded really good. What was coming out of the speakers was unique and entertaining.
Also, when you told that story, you were talking about bringing him into the radio station environment and that culture, and hoping that the long time radio vets wouldn't get a hold of him and pour Kool-Aid down his throat.
Yeah.
Was that, how did that happen? Did he? I mean, at some point, you do have to adapt some of your skill sets and some culture to the radio world.
Yeah.
But
Well, I mean, you've got to get the commercials on and off. And
yeah, right. The trains have to run on time, right?
We had some unique talent. Matt Pinfield, who'd been at VH1 and MTV, was our morning guy. And so, Matt was very good, and never really was a conformist radio person anyway. And so that worked. But it is tough, or at least it was then, to take someone and keep the other radio people away. I think if you're bringing in people who have certain life experiences that are similar, that would be easier. And it's part of why I still like people like Carletta and younger programmers, because they are not hindered with experiences that have failed. You were talking about discovering young talent earlier. A young woman named Hannah Lee is part of a morning show on WUSJ in Jackson, Mississippi, with Nate and Tracy. And they hired her. They found her. I had nothing to do with them hiring her. She was working in Baton Rouge, was kind of an intern, and they brought her in. And it took her 6 months, 9 months to really get into the groove of fitting into the morning show. But now she's really made that show very good. I mean, it was good, but now it's really good. And what I credit it with is Tracy, who's also the PD of that radio station. She allowed Hannah to bang into furniture like a young puppy, chew up the kids' toys, mess things up.
Yeah.
And just kept refining and refining and refining. But we tried not to put boundaries on her. We just tried to explain why some things worked better than others. And those are the kind of things that excite me. I'm not one of those guys that thinks it used to be better before. I'm excited about wherever we're going to go, because reality is we have some really good content. It's just being delivered a lot of different ways, a lot of different places.
Well, and quick note about Hannah. She is very omnipresent on social media and has taken that, not only the station brand, but her personal brand, and made it very, very strong. And Bob, to your point, she probably never had any because she's so young. She's only 23. She never had any handcuffs. So allowing her to bump into furniture and kind of mess things up, that's kind of real to listeners, right? So they probably appreciate that. Carletta, as someone that Mike hoped and dreamed he could work with back in 2018, of that generation, what do you feel like your generation of programmers, your colleagues, your peers, and I'm thinking of not only yourself but Ashley Wilson and Ashley Morrison, and some of those folks that are out there in major markets doing terrific work. Have you had the opportunity to put your fingerprint on this brand, the station, or the format? Do you feel like you've been given freedom and not had the handcuffs on to do what Mike hoped that younger generation could do back 7 years ago?
Um, to some extent, sure. I think that the way that those of us in this generation have been able to rise through the ranks the way that we did was the creativity that we brought to the table. Whether it was really creative imaging writing and creating great social content and on-air content, to having really fun ways of promotions that we did and things that we gave away and listener experiences and things like that. I think that part of it was really important, and that's kind of how we have been able to put our footprint on things. As far as being able to have that type of programming freedom that a lot of the generations before us had, I do not think that we've been given that freedom. Just to be completely truthful, I understand that there's a lot of bureaucracy that goes along with that, and we've already discussed, trying to dig out of the debts and the things that the corporations are trying to deal with, and I understand that on a corporate level. But if you're looking solely on a creative level, of what the quality of the product is that's being put out, I think that our generation feels like we could be doing things a lot differently and have not necessarily been given the opportunity to do that. So I think there's still a lot of things that we could do. And I think a lot of us are like, man, I just wish I could just do this thing. And unfortunately, I don't think that we've really been given that opportunity just yet, but I'm hopeful that it's coming.
Yeah. Yeah. What's been the toughest part of all that? Like the adaptation, having all those ideas, and I mean, you may have just covered it, but having all these ideas, how do you then, know that there are some restrictions on being able to express that? How have you been able to adapt? Because it is impressive that this generation has continued to kind of march through those challenges and still make a mark on our industry.
Well, I think that it's just that you look at the constraints and the box that you've been put in, and sometimes we kind of toe the line on the box. We push as much as we feel like we can, to be able to create the experience and the overall feel for whatever it is that we're doing, whether it's a promotion, the station in general, an experience that we're trying to give the listeners. And I think that the one thing that our generation has done really, really well is reviving that connectivity with the listener, becoming very authentically ourselves and showing that real life is what people really want.
So as we look forward for the next 7 years, one thing that we talked about the other day on this prep call was when I think of, I don't know if I'm alone here, I keep saying this, but when I think of 2018, when people talk about 2018, I think, oh, that was just a couple of years ago. Well, rounding up to 2025, and by the time CRS25 comes, that's 7 years ago. And its time is going really, really fast. So that's a lot of time. That's a lot of things that have happened in the last 7 years, right? The pandemic, which, part of the pandemic is it feels like it's 5 minutes ago, and other parts feels like it's 10 years ago, right? So it's the time warp is just crazy. So looking ahead here, just to kind of go around the horn. Bob, I'm going to start with you. What do you think are the most challenging things that are ahead for our business, that you think that we'll have to deal with, and that are opportunities?
I mean, I think the biggest challenge is AI. It's kind of the obvious one. And there are so many things that go with that. And so that would answer that question. I think where the opportunities are, with a question like this, it's you're either predicting or preparing. And I think it's preparing. I think, preparing for where the opportunity is. But if you have a sense of always looking for the opportunities while you're going through the day to day, as Carletta pointed out earlier, even though she was operating within a much smaller box than most of us operated in at the start of our career, and as we were rising through the ranks, um, Carletta, you just said it. There were opportunities there, and so you looked for those opportunities, and then it was your response to those that has led to your success so far. So, RJ, I think that's what I would say is that it's continue to look for, if it is AI, where are the opportunities within AI? What am I doing now? And how can I adjust my skills, the methods, procedures, approach to then respond to that either opportunity or challenge? And then that will help you achieve what you want to through the next 7 years. As far as predicting goes, that I'll leave that to the people with the crystal balls and who are much better at being futurists than I am. I think preparation is one of the best paths to take.
Your point about AI, and I think about how fast that's moving. 2 years ago at CRS, shortly before CRS, that sort of blew up and there was a big topic and we were able to jump on that. And Mike, the way you've described the evolution of that conversation from 23 to 24, I think like 23, I think you described it as forks and knives and
it was villagers with torches and pitchforks at the gate.
Yeah. Oh, I was in that session. Oh my gosh.
And then I flashed to a town hall that you and several others oversaw this year. It was much more calm, no panic, and the practical usage of AI. So, but that seems to be moving very quickly. What do you see that? How do you see that moving in the next few years? Will that become utilitarian like smart speakers and just part of the day-to-day at a radio station?
I think it's going to be, I think the answer is yes, it will become utilitarian. Yeah, Bob and I can probably remember a time when you spliced audio tape with a little white grease pencil and a razor, right? And so suddenly we were on a computer and doing audio edits, and it just became a thing and it's normal. And it's a form of AI. And so when you say artificial intelligence, regardless of format, regardless of business, people immediately think of job elimination. And it will create new jobs and people who are experts at it. I do think it's going to eliminate some jobs in broadcasting, but I think to be a little bit of a futurist, because of what I'm seeing on the horizon, because of what I'm seeing is the beginning of a move. These next couple years are going to see seismic changes. We're seeing people give radio stations back to the government. Never in my wildest dreams did I think I would see that. We are seeing continued elimination of positions. And I think that we have to brace ourselves for a model that's very much like the European model, where Virgin Radio is all across the country, where there is a rock format that's all across the country. And so I think we're going to see more of that big syndication footprint. There's a lot of it already, but we're not at that European model of it. And we have about 10 times the number of radio stations that they have. And so that's going to be seismic as to where that goes. And so the question then becomes, if you're an air talent, what do? You got to be one of the best there is, and you got to help generate revenue, and you got to make yourself so valuable that somebody has to sit down and have a conversation about eliminating your position and what damage it could do to the company. Those are the tough things that are out there ahead of us, but I think it's where we are. I think we're going to see more and more shows moved across multiple markets and multiple regions.
Carletta, what about you?
I actually really agree with everything that Bob and Mike have just said. I think that on a local level that, you're seeing so much consolidation now that maybe if you're on that local level, you need to be asking yourself, how can we meet the listeners where they live with the continued consolidation? And that, to Bob's point, that you need to be prepared for that. And so it needs to not be something that you're like, oh my gosh, what if this happens? It's going to happen. This is clearly the direction that we are headed. And I think that, to be able to find the balance between a more centralized syndication of a network or a company, and then also figuring out how to create that locality that we're used to with local radio, and finding what that will look like in the future is what we need to be preparing for now, and the questions that we need to be asking ourselves and how we can do that to be able to continue to serve the community. Because obviously, as we've seen just in the last few weeks with the natural disasters that have come through, we still very much need and rely on local radio to service our communities.
I'm so glad you brought that up, because I was going to try and end with that, because it's such a great reminder of the power of radio and the impact it can have on a local community with its listeners, and not only generating information that's important to people who may not have access to roads and water and other services, but they have a radio on their phone or wherever they're getting it. The work that's been done in North Carolina and Florida and other markets that were affected by those two hurricanes has been an incredible example of what radio does at its very, very best. And I think it's remarkable too that, we've just talked about the dwindling resources and how few people are in a radio station on a day-to-day level. The kind of work that these stations have done in those markets with less manpower than ever, and yet radio still delivered that important information and service that listeners rely on. And that's the magic of radio. I mean, I know that sounds really cliche, but it is, right?
No, it totally is. And actually, I think it's one of those things where we also have to analyze our digital infrastructure. We talked about this briefly on the call when we were getting prepared, but think about what happened whenever Microsoft went down for like 12 hours and how badly that affected so many different things on so many different levels. So whenever people talk about like, oh, well, is radio going to go away? I don't think it's never going to go away. We have a place, but we have to carve out what that's going to look like for us moving forward. And what has happened, especially in Florida and North Carolina specifically, and that team in Asheville, whenever I tell you, I have never been more proud to have been a part of what they used to do. Like, given the fact that I was on Kiss Country in Asheville for 2 years, the last 2 years until recently, it was incredible what they were able to do collectively. And it just shows how much we still need terrestrial radio in our country and how fragile our digital infrastructure really is. And so I think that we just now, again, have to ask ourselves those questions. And like Mike and Bob have said, just really start getting prepared for what the future will look like for us.
Before we put this together, Mike shared with me, I think you're going to have to help me here, Mike, because you were on a panel about the future of radio. So this isn't the first conversation you've had about the future of radio. And Mike shared the PowerPoint, and I think this is your quote, and I feel like it's a good place to end our conversation today. I think this is your quote from the slideshow that I saw, and it kind of ties in with what Mike was just saying about radio just a few minutes ago. But it says, radio has a future in the future, but how bright depends on how willing we are to acknowledge that today's status quo isn't good enough for tomorrow. And when I saw that quote, I thought that just sums it all up, don't you think, Mike?
Yeah, absolutely. And as I said earlier, I'm hopeful. I'm still positive. I just think, do you remember maybe 20 years ago when consolidation was happening in so many businesses? The book came out, Who Moved My Cheese? Ken Johnson.
Oh, yes. Yep.
And everybody was buying that book and reading. Well, that cheese is going to keep moving. That cheese is not going to stop moving ever. And so, yeah, I wrote that quote with that in mind, that we do have a bright future, but we just can't sit down and think it's just going to happen. We got to work hard.
Hey, I appreciate all of you today. Bob Richards from TuneIn, Mike McVay with McVay Media, and Carletta. You are taking some time off now to raise that kid of yours. And we know we're going to see you back in radio and contributing and having more success as you have in the past. Thank you for your time today. And I just wanted to share everyone's contact information, because I know when people watch these, they may have a question for one or all of you, and this is how you reach all of our panelists today. So any parting shots from anybody before we sign off?
I mean, you're not getting rid of me that easy. You're right. Like I'm coming back. I'm not worried about that part.
Yeah. Yeah. We're glad about that. Well, thanks everybody. Have a great day. And this is how you follow CRS on socials, CRS360. Thanks for participating today, everybody.